On the outskirts of a small, forgotten town, there was a house that everyone avoided. The local children whispered about it in schoolyards. Teenagers dared each other to get close, but no one ever stayed long. The house had stood abandoned for decades, its windows dark, dark, and hollow, like empty eye sockets watching the world decay around it. Every Halloween, the stories would start up again, stories about the people who had gone in and never come out. One year, a group of friends, eager for a thrill, decided that they were brave enough to spend Halloween night inside the house. There was Sam, the fearless leader who laughed in the face of danger. Emma, always curious, always questioning. Max, who pretended not to believe in ghosts but flinched at every strange noise. And Katie, the quiet one, who never wanted to be left behind but always seemed on edge when things got too real. The night was thick with fog, the moon a pale sliver barely piercing the darkness. The old house loomed in front of them, vines creeping up its walls, the wood groaning as if the building itself was alive. They hesitated at the front gate, but Sam, ever the fearless one, pushed forward, saying, "Come on, it's just a house. What's the worst that could happen?" They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dust-choked air. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and the house smelled of rot, like something had been left to decay in the walls for years. As they moved deeper into the house, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. Their breath fogged in front of them, and even Sam seemed a little quieter than usual. They found an old living room, its furniture draped in dusty white sheets. A grandfather clock in the corner stood still, its hands frozen at midnight. Emma, curious as always, began to inspect the objects in the room, old photographs, a rusted fireplace poker, a torn book lying on a table. She picked it up, and as soon as her fingers touched the brittle pages, the clock's hands began to spin, rapidly ticking toward midnight. "What the hell?" Max said, backing away. But Sam laughed it off, even as his eyes darted toward the clock. "It's just a mechanical glitch. Relax." Then the first scream pierced the air. It was distant, coming from somewhere deep in the house, but unmistakably human. Katie's face drained of color. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Sam shook his head. "No way. This is just getting interesting." Against Katie's protests, they ventured further into the house, following the sound of the scream. It echoed through the halls, leading them down into the basement, where the smell of rot became overwhelming. The door to the basement was old, its hinges rusted, but when Sam touched it, it swung open easily, as if it had been waiting for them. The basement was worse than they had imagined. The walls were lined with strange symbols carved deep into the stone, and in the center of the room was a table. On it lay something that had once been human, but now was just a dried husk, its skin stretched tight over bones. Its mouth was open in a permanent scream. Emma backed away, her flashlight flickering. "This isn't right," she muttered. "This isn't right." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut, trapping them inside. The air grew thick, and the temperature dropped even more. They heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy, coming from the shadows at the far end of the room. A shape emerged, tall and gaunt, with eyes that gleamed unnaturally in the dark. It whispered, but the sound filled the room as if the walls themselves were speaking. "You should not have come," Katie screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the house, vanishing into the oppressive silence that followed. Sam tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, no matter how hard he pushed or kicked. Max's flashlight died, and they were plunged into near darkness, save for the pale glow from the creature's eyes. Then the basement began to shift. The walls creaked and groaned as if they were alive, and the carvings began to pulse with a sickly red light. The floor beneath them buckled, and from the cracks in the stone, hands, hundreds of hands, began to reach up, skeletal and desperate, clawing at their feet. Sam tried to fight them off, but there were too many. They wrapped around his ankles, pulling him down into the earth. His screams echoed through the room, blending with the distant, inhuman moans that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Emma grabbed a piece of wood from the floor, trying to fend them off, but they were relentless, pulling, tearing, dragging them all down. Katie was the last to fall, her fingers scraping against the stone floor as she was pulled into the darkness. The last thing she saw before the blackness swallowed her was the creature, standing over them, smiling with a mouthful of sharp, jagged teeth. When the house was finally silent again, the basement floor smoothed over as if nothing had happened. The clock in the living room stopped ticking, its hands frozen at midnight once more. The house stood quiet, waiting, as it always had, for the next set of foolish souls to enter its doors. By morning, no one in the town noticed the four missing friends. They had become part of the town's lore, another group swallowed by the house that should have remained forgotten. There's an old legend in a small town about a stretch of road deep in the forest, a road so narrow and winding that even locals avoid driving down it after dark. They say that if you do, strange things happen. Your radio goes static, your headlights flicker, and shadows begin to move on the edge of the trees. But the scariest part is the hitchhiker. Some say he's a man, others swear it's something else. No one who picks him up ever makes it home. One cold October night, a man named Jacob, a traveling salesman, was passing through the town. He'd heard the stories, but thought them nothing more than ghost tales to keep kids from speeding through the woods. His GPS, glitching in the thick forest, redirected him onto the narrow road. He barely noticed as he turned onto it, thinking it would be a shortcut to the highway. The road seemed endless, snaking through dense trees that blocked out even the faint light of the moon. His car's headlights barely pierced the suffocating darkness. The trees on either side of the road were unnaturally still, their twisted branches reaching out like claws as if waiting to pull him in. As he drove further, the silence became oppressive, so complete that it felt unnatural. No wind, no animals, not even the rustle of leaves, just the low hum of his car's engine and his own shallow breathing. He glanced down at his radio. It had gone to static without him noticing. He flicked the dial, but nothing changed. A cold sweat prickled the back of his neck. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. It was a man, standing perfectly still, his back turned to the car, just at the edge of the tree line. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, worn trousers and a long coat that looked like they belonged to another era. The man didn't move, didn't seem to notice the car at all. Jacob's instinct was to drive past, but something made him slow down. His foot hovered over the brake as he looked at the figure again in his rearview mirror. Maybe the man needed help. Maybe he was lost. Against his better judgment, Jacob stopped the car. He rolled down the window and called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" The man didn't respond. Jacob felt a chill, but he brushed it off as nerves. He was being ridiculous. He called out again, louder this time, but the figure still didn't move. Finally, after a long pause, the man slowly turned to face him. Jacob froze. The man's face was wrong. His features were stretched and distorted, as though someone had pulled his skin too tight over his skull. His eyes were too wide, too bright, gleaming with a sickly, unnatural light. But what truly terrified Jacob was the smile, a grotesque, lipless grin that spread impossibly wide across the man's face, exposing a row of teeth that were too sharp, too long. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car shot forward, tires screeching on the narrow road. He didn't dare look back, but he felt it, the presence of the hitchhiker. He could hear the soft patter of footsteps running alongside the car, though the road was far too narrow for anyone to keep pace. The static on the radio grew louder, shrieking through the speakers. The headlights began to flicker, plunging him into darkness for seconds at a time. And each time the lights came back on, the hitchhiker was closer, his unnaturally stretched face filling the rearview mirror, grinning that horrible grin. Jacob's hands shook as he gripped the wheel tighter, speeding down the road as fast as he could without careening off into the trees. The footsteps didn't stop. The hitchhiker was getting closer, closer, until it felt like he was right outside the window, his fingers brushing the glass. Jacob was hyperventilating, eyes wide with terror, his pulse thundering in his ears. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The static cut out. The headlights stopped flickering. The road ahead stretched out before him, empty and dark, and there was no sound but the low hum of the car's engine. Jacob glanced in the rearview mirror. The hitchhiker was gone. He let out a shaky breath, his heart still hammering in his chest. He drove for what felt like hours before the road finally widened, leading him back into the safety of the town. He didn't stop until he reached the first gas station, pulling into the lot and shutting off the car. His hands were still trembling as he reached for his phone to check the time. It was dead. His phone, his car clock, everything had stopped at exactly midnight. His skin crawled with unease. He hurried inside the gas station, his heart in place, desperate for some sense of normalcy. The clerk looked up at him, eyes narrowing as if she recognized him. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Jacob forced a weak laugh. "You could say that." She looked him over for a moment, then her expression darkened. "You didn't take the forest road, did you?" Jacob's blood ran cold. "How did you know?" The clerk didn't answer right away. Instead, she nodded toward the window, her voice lowering to a whisper. "There's something wrong with that road. No one ever comes back the same." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He turned slowly to look at his reflection in the gas station window. And there, staring back at him, was the hitchhiker's face, his own features stretched and distorted with that same grotesque, lipless grin. There's a legend in the mountains, whispered among the few who still dare to live in the shadow of the old logging town of Pine Hollow. The town was abandoned decades ago after a series of grisly accidents claimed the lives of its workers. People said the forest wanted revenge. Some said the accidents were no accidents at all. But the darkest story is about the lumberman, the spirit of a man who was never laid to rest. No one who ventured into the ruins of Pine Hollow ever returned. And though the town stood empty, the locals swore that on certain nights you could still hear the sound of an axe echoing through the trees. It was one of those nights when Sarah, an avid hiker and thrill seeker, decided to visit the old logging camp with her boyfriend Jake. They had heard the stories, laughed about them even, but to Sarah it was just another urban legend, something to spice up their hike. The two of them packed their gear and set out for Pine Hollow, eager to explore the forgotten ruins. The trail was overgrown, nearly swallowed by the encroaching forest. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of their boots on the dead leaves and the occasional rustle of the trees. It was unsettling, but Sarah shrugged it off. Jake, too, seemed a bit unnerved, but they pressed on, joking about the cursed woods. As the sun began to set, they reached the remains of Pine Hollow. The town was in ruins. What was left of the logging camp stood like skeletons, old wooden structures leaning at odd angles, their beams creaking in the wind. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. They wandered through the remains of the camp, poking around the old tools and shattered windows, taking photos, laughing at the absurdity of the whole thing. But as dusk settled in, the atmosphere grew heavier. The forest seemed to press in on them, and the wind carried faint, distant sounds, the faint echo of something metallic. Sarah stopped, listening. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Jake froze beside her, tilting his head. There it was again, thunk, like the dull, repetitive sound of an axe hitting wood. It echoed faintly through the trees. "Probably just some animal knocking something over," Jake said, though his voice lacked confidence. But Sarah wasn't so sure. The sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. She glanced toward the tree line where the forest grew darker, more menacing. Her heart began to race, an instinctual fear creeping up her spine. "Let's check it out," she said, trying to sound brave. Jake hesitated, but eventually nodded. They moved toward the sound, their flashlights cutting through the thickening gloom. The deeper they went, the louder the sound became. Thunk, thunk, steady and methodical, like someone working the same piece of wood over and over. It was too dark now to see much beyond the beam of their flashlights, and the woods around them had taken on a life of their own, the trees bending in ways that seemed unnatural, the shadows moving just out of the corner of their eyes. Then the sound stopped. Sarah and Jake froze, their breath held, as the sudden silence felt like a weight pressing down on them. The forest had gone deathly still. They turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. "This is getting weird," Jake muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. A crack echoed behind them, a branch snapping underfoot. They whipped around, flashlights trembling. There was nothing but the trees. But something moved. Just at the edge of their light, they saw a figure standing still, too still, half hidden in the shadows. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, wearing what looked like the ragged remains of a lumberjack's outfit, torn flannel shirt, thick boots caked with mud. But his face, it wasn't right. Even in the shadows, she could see it. His skin was pale, stretched too tight across his skull, and where his eyes should have been were empty sockets, black and hollow. The figure held an axe in one hand, the blade stained and rusted. Slowly, it raised the axe over its shoulder, the motion eerily smooth, as if it wasn't a man at all but a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Run," Sarah whispered. Jake didn't need to be told twice. They both turned and bolted through the forest, crashing through the underbrush, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the axe thunk followed them, closer now, impossibly close. Sarah didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. The presence gaining on them, hear the scrape of heavy boots on the ground, the swish of the axe through the air. The trees seemed to shift and warp around them, the trail disappearing into the darkness. Panic clawed at her mind, and she realized they were lost, the path they had come in on swallowed by the forest. Jake tripped and fell, and Sarah skidded to a halt, grabbing his arm. "Get up!" she screamed, pulling him to his feet. But it was too late. The lumberman was there, standing just feet away, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His grin, an impossible, wide grin, stretched across his face, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. Jake screamed, stumbling backward as the axe came down. Sarah didn't watch. She couldn't. She just ran, not knowing where she was going, her lungs burning, her legs numb with fear. The sound of the axe, thunk, echoed behind her, mixed with Jake's fading cries. She didn't stop until she broke free of the forest, her body trembling uncontrollably. When she looked back, the woods were still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The police found her the next morning, wandering along the highway, half mad with fear. She tried to tell them about the lumberman, about what had happened to Jake, but they just shook their heads, dismissing it as trauma from a fall or exposure to the cold. But Sarah knew what she had seen. She knew the sound of that axe would never leave her, that the forest was alive with something dark and ancient. And she knew one thing for sure: no one ever really leaves Pine Hollow. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there was a house that everyone whispered about but never dared to approach. It was a large, Victorian-style home, once beautiful but now decaying with age. Its windows were boarded up, the paint peeled off in long strips, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. The house had been abandoned for years, but what made it infamous were the stories. They called it the Reflection House. The tale was simple. No one who looked into the mirrors inside ever left. People said the mirrors in the house didn't reflect what was real. They reflected something else, something twisted. The few who had gone in as part of a dare or some wild teenage challenge were never seen again. Their bodies were never found. The house, they said, took them. Maya, a skeptical college student, had heard the stories all her life, but never believed a word of it. She was studying urban legends for a paper and decided the Reflection House would be the perfect subject to debunk. She convinced her friends, Lena, Jordan, and Will, to join her on Halloween night. They didn't believe in the supernatural either, but the idea of exploring an infamous haunted house was too tempting to resist. They arrived just as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. The house loomed over them, its dark windows like eyes watching their every move. Maya led the way, breaking through the rusted gate with a crowbar and pushing open the front door, which creaked ominously on its hinges. The smell of damp and rot hit them immediately, but they pushed forward, flashlights cutting through the thick, dusty air. The interior was worse than they imagined. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, the floors littered with debris, and the air felt oppressive, thick with a sense of being watched. But what stood out most were the mirrors. There were dozens of them, scattered throughout the house, some hanging crookedly on the walls, others leaning against furniture, all covered in a thin layer of grime. "Easy to see how the stories started," Jordan muttered, wiping dust off one of the mirrors with his sleeve. People probably scared themselves looking into these things. But as he wiped the glass clean, Maya noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. It showed Jordan, but different. His face looked a little distorted, like a funhouse mirror. But there was something darker in his eyes, something sinister. "Don't wipe them off," Maya said suddenly, her voice sharper than she intended. "Let's just document the house and leave." Lena chuckled nervously. "You're not scared, are you?" Maya forced a laugh. Of course not. It's just creepy, you know? They moved deeper into the house instead of taking photos, making notes, and laughing about the ridiculousness of the stories. But the deeper they went, the stranger the house became. The mirrors seemed to multiply, appearing in every corner, every hallway, even rooms they swore didn't have mirrors when they entered. Each reflection was slightly off, like something behind the glass was watching them, waiting. In one room, Will paused, staring into a mirror that stood propped against the wall. "Guys," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Come look at this." Maya and the others gathered around him. The reflection in the mirror showed the room they were standing in, but there were more people. Shadowy figures stood just out of sight, their faces obscured, their bodies barely visible in the gloom, and one of them was right behind Will. "Jesus," Lena whispered, stepping back. "What the hell?" Will spun around, but there was no one there. He looked back at the mirror, and the figure was still there, still standing just behind him, closer now. His breath came in shallow, panicked bursts. "We should leave," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." Maya felt the same panic rising in her chest, but she fought it down. "It's just a trick of the light," she said, trying to convince herself as much as the others. "It's nothing." But the more they looked, the more the reflections twisted. The figures in the mirrors weren't just shadowy anymore. They were stepping forward, their faces becoming clearer. And they weren't just random figures. They were the friends who had disappeared over the years, the ones who had never come back from their dares. "Let's get out of here," Jordan said, backing toward the door. They turned to leave, but the house had changed. The hallway they had come from was gone, replaced by a long corridor lined with even more mirrors, each one reflecting something different, distorted versions of themselves, faces twisted in pain or anger, figures that didn't belong. Panic set in. They ran, not caring where they went, just desperate to get away. But every turn led to more mirrors, more impossible reflections. The house was a maze, closing in on them, trapping them. Lena was the first to fall. She screamed as she stumbled into a room full of mirrors, her reflection multiplying 1,000 times over. Maya and the others rushed in after her, but it was too late. Lena stood frozen in front of one of the mirrors, her eyes wide with terror. In the reflection, her mouth moved, silently screaming, even though her real body stood still. Then, before their eyes, she vanished, sucked into the glass. "Jesus Christ!" Will yelled, grabbing Maya's arm. "We need to go." But there was nowhere to go. The mirrors surrounded them, and in each one, the shadows grew closer. Maya could feel them, cold fingers brushing her skin, whispering in her ear, pulling at her. Jordan tried to smash one of the mirrors with a chair, but as soon as he shattered it, the shards on the floor reflected the figures even more clearly, and they started to crawl out from the broken glass. One by one, they fell. The house claimed them, just as it had claimed all the others. Maya was the last, running blindly through the halls, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. She didn't know where the others were anymore, but she could hear them, faint voices echoing from the mirrors calling her name, begging for help. Finally, she found herself in front of the largest mirror in the house, an ornate, cracked monstrosity that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. She saw herself in it, but the reflection wasn't right. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and stretched, her mouth twisted into a horrible grin, and behind her, the shadows stood, waiting. Maya reached out, her hand trembling as it touched the glass. The surface was cold, and for a moment she saw the truth. The house wasn't haunted by ghosts. The mirrors were prisons, and the reflections were the souls trapped inside, twisted and distorted by years of isolation. They were hungry, desperate to escape. But there was only one way to free them. The house needed new souls. As Maya's hand touched the glass, she felt it pull her in, felt the cold, clawing fingers wrap around her and drag her into the dark. The last thing she saw before the world went black was her own reflection smiling back at her, no longer hollow, no longer twisted. And then there was silence. The house stood empty again, waiting for the next group of curious souls to wander in, drawn by the whispers, by the lure of the unknown. The mirrors waited too, their surfaces smooth and still, hiding the truth beneath. And on certain nights, if you stand outside the reflection house and listen closely, you can hear them, the faint echoes of the trapped calling out for help, begging to be freed. But once you look into the mirrors, it's already too late. There's a story about a game, one that's whispered about in certain circles, mostly online, on forums buried deep within the internet. It's called the Midnight Game. Supposedly, it's an ancient ritual used as a form of punishment for those who dared to break the rules of society. But the instructions are simple enough, and for those who crave the thrill of the supernatural, it's become a dangerous dare, a challenge to test their courage. One October night, three friends, Erica, Dave, and Sophie, decided to play it. They were bored, looking for something to do, and dare sounded like fun. They'd read the warnings about how playing the game could open a door to something dark, something you couldn't undo. But they didn't believe in such things. Ghost stories weren't real and nothing bad ever happened to them. So they prepared for it. The game had to begin exactly at midnight. Each player needed a candle, a piece of paper with their full name written on it, a drop of their own blood smeared on the paper, and a wooden match to light the candle. The house had to be dark, completely sealed off from the outside world. And once the clock struck 12, they were supposed to knock on the front door 22 times, then step inside and close the door behind them. Simple. Erica, being the bravest, insisted on being the one to lead the ritual. "It's just a game," she said, laughing as she pricked her finger with a needle and smeared the blood on her paper. The others followed suit, though Sophie seemed nervous. At exactly 11:59, they stood in the foyer of Erica's house, waiting for the clock to hit midnight. The air in the house seemed colder than usual, the darkness pressing in from all sides. But Erica was excited, practically bouncing on her toes. Midnight. She knocked 22 times, and the door creaked open as they stepped inside. The house felt different. Still, it was just a game. Erica lit her candle, as did Dave and Sophie. They followed the next step, walking through the house in total silence, making sure their candles stayed lit. If the candle blew out, the instructions said you had exactly 10 seconds to relight it. If you couldn't, you were supposed to surround yourself with a circle of salt and stay inside it until 3:33 a.m., the end of the game. It sounded silly, like a twisted form of hide and seek, and they joked about it as they wandered through the darkened house, careful not to let their flames flicker. The first hour passed without incident, and Sophie's nerves seemed to ease. "See," she whispered. "It's nothing. We're fine." But then Erica's candle blew out. She froze, staring at the wick as it smoked in the dark. 10 seconds, right?" she said, laughing nervously. She fumbled for her matches, but her hands were shaking now. The darkness felt heavier around her, more solid. She struck the match, but it fizzled out. "Relax, you've got time," Dave said, though his voice was tense. She struck another match. This time it lit, and she hurriedly brought the flame to her candle. The light flickered to life, casting long shadows on the walls around them. Erica exhaled in relief. "Told you. Easy," but Dave was staring at something over her shoulder. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something between confusion and fear. "Erica," he whispered, "look." She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, standing in the darkness just beyond the reach of her candlelight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body impossibly long, its arms hanging down to its knees. It wore no clothes, just pale, translucent skin stretched too tight over its bones. Its face was featureless, just smooth, blank flesh where eyes and a mouth should have been. Erica gasped, stepping back, her candle shaking in her hand. "Is that?" But before she could finish, the candle flickered out again. This time, the darkness swallowed them completely. The temperature in the house dropped even lower, and a sound, like the soft scrape of fingernails on wood, began to echo through the hallways. Sophie whimpered, clutching her candle as though it was her lifeline. "Light it!" Dave hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Erica's hands fumbled for the matches again, her breath quick and shallow. She struck one, but it broke in her hand. The soft scraping grew louder, closer. Another match. This time it lit, but her shaking fingers couldn't steady the candle. The match went out. "Erica!" Sophie's voice trembled, her own candle beginning to flicker. They couldn't see it, but they could feel it. Something moving in the darkness, something circling them. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, almost like breathing. It was right there, just beyond the edge of the light. Erica's final match lit, and she desperately tried to relight her candle, but the flames sputtered, as if the air itself was resisting it. And then she heard it, a voice not from the darkness, but from her own mind. A whisper that wasn't her own, telling her to give in, to stop resisting, to let the dark take her. Panicking, she dropped the match. It hit the ground and went out. Her candle was dead, and the darkness surged forward, filling the room with a presence that felt alive, malevolent. "The salt!" Dave yelled, his voice shaking as he grabbed the bag they'd brought, hastily pouring a circle on the floor. "Get inside the circle!" They huddled together in the salt ring, their candles the only light left. But the darkness pressed against them like something alive, pushing at the edges of their protection. The sound of breathing surrounded them, heavy and slow, like something massive was standing right on the edge, watching, waiting. Time crawled. The minutes stretched on, each one longer than the last. Sophie sobbed quietly, her candle flickering dangerously low, while Dave whispered to himself, repeating the rules of the game as if they were a prayer. 3:33 a.m. felt like it would never come. The air in the house grew heavier, thicker, the oppressive feeling of being watched growing more intense. And then, just when they thought they couldn't take it any longer, the breathing stopped. A silence fell over the house. Not a peaceful silence, but the kind of quiet that made their skin crawl like the calm before a storm. And then the clock chimed, once, twice, 3 times, and it was over. The candles stayed lit. The darkness receded, and the house felt normal again, as if whatever had been hunting them had retreated. They didn't waste a second. They bolted for the door, scrambling out into the cool pre-dawn air, gasping for breath. Erica's hands shook as she locked the door behind them, her heart still pounding in her chest. "Never again," she whispered. "Never." But as they stood outside, trying to calm themselves, Dave looked down at his watch, his face drained of color. "Erica," he said slowly, showing her the time. It was 3:28 a.m. They still had 5 minutes to go. Before they could react, the front door behind them creaked open.